We're going to be talking about a case that we are going to do a massive deep dive into later in the season, the Parkland school shooting. But we wanted to touch on it because there's been some developments. But before we talk about what's actually happened recently, give us a bit of a brief description for those listeners that might not know.
How sad it is that we don't remember the details. And you said Parkland because we've come to know every shooting by a single name. In fact, this is the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School shooting in Parkland, Florida, where a shooter killed 17, 14 of them were students, and injured 17. So very horrific incident. Every death is horrific, but a high school shooting, big, huge campus. They had many buildings. This is a shooter who went into one of the buildings when he was 19 years old and went into the school, shot a bunch of people, wounded 17, killed 17. This was February 14th, 2018. So actually it's been 4 years. It's hard to believe.
February 14th, that's Valentine's Day. It's an easy one to remember, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, right. Yeah, especially for survivors from the school and parents. And the reason that I wanted to just catch us up on this is something that's ongoing. So there'll be more due diligence on this. But this is one of those situations where we have a live shooter, and many times we may not have a live shooter. So the intrigue about who is this person and why did this person do what they did? And then also, how did the community react? And I just want to say this at the outset. So many times when we have a shooter who is killed at the scene or kills himself at the scene, one of the struggles that communities have is there's no one to blame. There's no solace. Who did something wrong? Why didn't somebody catch this? And when you have a shooter who's down, then people turn to the shooter's parents or the shooter's spouse or the place of employment or the school and say, you should have done a better job. But here we have a shooter.
Even if you've got a live shooter, the questions that I'm sure a lot of survivors and parents would want to know is why, and how often would the shooter ever even really share that afterwards in your experience?
The shooters do over time because their ego is a lot of what's involved and why they're doing what they want to do. Over time, they share often with behavioral experts who go in and interview them in research efforts.
Okay.
We saw that with people like mass killers like John Wayne Gacy here in the United States in the Chicago area, but other serial killers who are willing to be interviewed later. But of course, right now we have a subject who isn't going to be interviewed by anybody about why he did it unless he fashions what he wants to say. And we will see that. So I think this is something that is coming. So what's going on right now is the subject has pled guilty to all the murder charges and the attempted murders. In the state of Florida, if you're found guilty and convicted of murder, you can be killed. You can be sentenced to the death penalty.
Okay, so you've got the death penalty in Florida.
Yeah, some states have it, some states don't, but Florida definitely does.
And even if you plead guilty, that doesn't get you out of the death penalty. There's no kind of workaround there.
No, so the workaround in the United States, the court systems have a trial first, and then after the trial, they have a sentencing hearing.
Yeah.
And the sentencing hearing decides the punishment that's imposed. That's what's going on right now. The subject has pled guilty, so they're just a few days into what they expect might be a 4-month process for the sentencing.
When you say 4 months, who makes that decision? Is it a judge or is it a jury for a sentencing? Because he's already pled guilty.
So that's the defendant's option. And most state laws allow the defendant to choose whether they want a jury to set their punishment or whether they want the judge to set their punishment.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, US laws, they're strange.
Which way has it gone with this case then? Are they doing the jury or are they doing the judge?
So a jury is hearing this. It's a 4-month trial, though, where they hear all kinds of evidence that begins with what happened at the scene. Mm-hmm. So police officers come in, testify about what they saw when they arrived. Medical examiners come in and testify about what happened when they got to the scene and found bodies and body parts and what they witnessed with regard to each individual who was killed. For example, one of the medical examiners has already testified, even though we know this part of the sentencing hearing is going to go on for a long time. Some of the interesting things that are coming out even early on in the sentencing include, for instance, the medical examiners testifying about what he or she found. In this case, at the scene, he found that this 15-year-old who had been killed, there were leg injuries. And the prosecutors were able to put into this case the fact that the individual, the 15-year-old young man, had been shot while he was helping other people move through a classroom door. And the killer had gone up to this 15-year-old boy and put 4 rounds directly into his head on the scene. Close range.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. 4 rounds. And you know what? I didn't say, but I wanted to say aloud for the respect and the family of that 15-year-old boy. His name was Peter Wang. And that's the boy who was killed helping others and was then shot at point blank range. Peter Wang. He's a hero and a victim of this horrible shooting. And as there were, of course, many others. But since I mentioned him, I wanted to make sure that I mentioned him by name. So the reality of what is going on is being played out every hour in the courtroom in the most grisly details that you can imagine.
Are the families present?
Yes. So sentencing is open. And even if somebody pleads guilty, you still have to prove up your case, they call it. And so that this is part of what you're doing is proving the case. I think from a historical standpoint, you don't want somebody to plead guilty to a crime they didn't commit because they're forced to plead guilty and then the prosecutor never has to put forth any evidence to show they really were guilty. That's part of the reason that you put this information forward.
I know in the New Zealand court system, you would have the opportunity during that whole sentencing process for victim impact statements. Is that something that will happen? Would you see parents come forward, survivors come forward and be able to give their evidence in this sentencing part?
Yes, we'll see all of that to come in the next couple of weeks. Right now, they're just putting the case on about what really happened. So they've brought in law enforcement officers to talk about when they responded and how they responded. There was an Uber driver, for instance, who dropped off the killer at the school. And the killer had a case with him and he said, "Oh, I'm going to my music lesson." He had a guitar case with him and he didn't. He had a semi-automatic rifle inside that he was carrying, but the Uber driver testified, "Oh, he looked nervous." Well, sometimes that stuff is, and not questioning this driver, but people say all kinds of things after the fact. "Oh, I knew he was kind of strange. I knew he was a problem," but nobody reports it, right? So it's a question of how nervous was he? How suspicious was the driver? Maybe not really, but after the fact, he wasn't my normal customer. So the driver testifies, the police officers testify. They're beginning today to bring in students who were in the classroom who survived, students in the building who survived. We've talked to Max Schachter. Max's son, Alex, was killed at Marjory Stoneman Douglas. And Max is in the courtroom. And just, I think today there was a young man who testified that he was there and he was shot. He didn't recognize that he was shot, and which happens. Sometimes you're shocked and you don't feel it momentarily. But he said he looked up and Alex Schachter was sitting in front of him, slumped over in his chair. And he said that was the reality of him beginning to understand that Alex was probably dead and he was injured himself.
So heartbreaking. And we do have those interviews to come on the season.
And I will say for listeners, we want to do Parkland and we will. And I told Sarah, I thought it was important that we give it the time to have the evidence come out and that we do have a live shooter. There'll be more that comes out. Even in the sentencing phase, there'll be a ton that comes out and it'll be the first opportunity to see the whole scope of the government's case against the individual. And it will give us some of the whys. Everybody wants the why, but it's more important to say how not to let it happen again. So there's a little cross between the two. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay, so you are former prosecutor. Tell me what you expect this sentence to end up looking like. What are the options? What's the least he can get in the system? What's, obviously we know the most is the death penalty.
Yes, but the sentencing phase is standardized. You get lots of evidence in, and then there's a decision, and it's literally a voting decision, or if it's a judge, then the judge says, "This is how I find," and will provide a recitation for the record of what the sentencing is. And then if it's a jury, in any case, the jury will vote, and they vote on whatever that sentencing is. It would be unusual if it didn't happen. In cases like this, the judge always makes a statement about the subject and about what they found. There will be an element of what we call a pre-sentence investigation that's done by probation and parole. So that means that they go back and look at the subject's history and find out everything about him that is an aggravation and mitigation about his upbringing and his attitudes. And that will give us a very good picture of what they were able to learn about the shooter at the time. And even pre-sentence investigations, probation and parole will make a recommendation on whether or not somebody should receive the death penalty. And each state has a little bit of different ways they do it. Whatever the sentence is, he's agreed to plead guilty. So it's at least life in prison without parole. Or if he is convicted and sentenced to death penalty, there will be an automatic appeal. This was a 19-year-old shooter at the time, so he's 23-year-old now, living in an adult prison for the rest of his life.
So when you say life in prison without parole, does that mean life in prison? So I know that in some countries, life is a sentence of 14 years or a different length of time, but America is life means life.
Life means life. And if he's sentenced to death, he will be what we call on death row, and he will appeal it. The compelling arguments are often things like, the subject is young. Is there a chance to rehabilitate him in some way to give society some value out of this person? That sounds crazy when you're talking about somebody who killed 17 and wounded 17 more and would have done a better job, but he fled the school. One of the victims has a brother who was down the street in a McDonald's, and the police arrested the subject down the street. First, he stopped in that McDonald's. The surveillance video shows he walked through the McDonald's and he sat down in the booth where the brother is sitting.
He sat down in the booth where the brother was sitting.
Yeah. But I don't know for sure if he knew that he had shot this young man's brother. He was looking for a ride. Remember, he came in an Uber. He didn't have a ride.
Okay.
So he sat down in the
sure.
booth. He's like, I need you to give me a ride.
And did he know this person beforehand?
I don't know that he did.
I mean,
there's so many pieces to
wow.
it. It's creepy. The families of survivors and families are going to be getting some information about the shooter that they didn't have before. But I don't know that it's necessarily going to satisfy them, because in the end, Ryan's daughter's still gone. Max's son is still gone. The kids are still gone.